Well, that was a look back at a 60 Minutes interview with Ross Perot back in 1992. He would go on to win nearly 20% of the vote in that election, one of the most successful showings for a third-party presidential candidate in modern American political history. Are there lessons from his run from that year and the crop of third-party candidates, as a large number of Americans tell pollsters they want an alternative? Presidential historian Doug Wead is joining us now from Washington. Doug, Ross Perot, 20% in 1992. Can Gary Johnson get there?
I don't think he can. Theoretically, he should. This is the perfect time for him. 60% of the American people are open to the idea of a third party. We have the two most unpopular candidates since we've polled approval ratings. You have to go all the way back to 1884 to find an election where the American people said, how did we get here? And that was when James Blaine ran against Grover Cleveland. It was a corrupt politician who took money in return for favors against a New York misogynist. And Grover Cleveland won that one.
I want to ask you, though, we were just talking earlier, and you were trying to explain to me, Nick, you don't actually have to win 270 for Gary Johnson to actually be considered a success. What do you mean by that?
So this is really important. So Gary Johnson says with a straight face that he's trying to win it, and that he actually believes he has a shot at winning. Bill Weld says that too. They don't actually think they're going to get 270 electoral votes if they're going to win California or win New York or something. Their strategy, and this is important and explains why they have tiny bit of confidence, they just have to win something. If they can win 10 electoral votes, if Johnson can win his home state of New Mexico, if they can win Utah, if they can possibly win New Hampshire after the endorsement of the union leader, and if Trump and Clinton stay really close, then nobody will get a majority and the election will be thrown to the House of Representatives. And that's their real strategy. So their success, in some states, they just may need to get 35% of the vote in order to get some electoral votes. It's not going to happen, but it's not as far off and as impossible as it may seem.
I've got to actually ask the elections director, how likely is that of a chance to happen?
Well, there are a couple of states. I mean, we talked about, places like Utah or maybe places like New Hampshire. If that is, in fact, his strategy, that's what you do. You go to a smaller state, one that doesn't take a lot of advertising, one that doesn't take a lot of ground game, and you try to put a stake in the ground there. Look, it is not set in stone anywhere that there can only be two major parties. This is a result of two parties that for a long time have carved out their coalitions, carved out their donors, and that's what we have here. So this is really up to the voters, and I think it all sort of underlines that point that, you can vote for whomever you want to vote for, but most folks do have those longstanding party attachments, and that's what makes it harder for somebody to crack through nationally.
Doug, we know Johnson and Weld told Steve Kroft that they're running against the two-party system. We've heard that from many past third-party candidates. Have third-party candidates made progress in that fight?
No, they haven't. In fact, I disagree with some of your panelists on that. When I took an office in the White House with George H.W. Bush, the very first week, I had the president of a corporation sitting opposite me. He said, now you're going to support this legislation, this. I said, well, why? He said, because the Democrats do it, the Republicans have to do it. It's the way it's done here in Washington. We'll fall behind if we don't. And so Republican administrations, Democratic administrations, our viewers can Google it and look it up. It's corporate welfare. Millions of dollars go to the companies that then give donations to the Republican Party and the Democrat Party. It's even more sophisticated than that. I had these popular pundits sitting in my office before the week was over. I'd seen them on TV, and I find out they get grants from the think tanks. They get paid to write articles for the magazines, liberal and conservative, Democrat and Republican. As long as there's a pipeline of money flowing to the Republican Party and the Democrat Party from government, a third party does not have a chance.
Want to pipe in there, Ray?
Well, I would just point out the Bernie Sanders phenomena of fundraising this year. He raised $250 million, and very little of it was corporate. It was mostly off the internet. It was mostly from the millennials that we've been talking about tonight that are fueling Johnson's run. And by the way, that's almost $100 million more than Donald Trump's raised to date. So it's not that you can't do it. I think the fundamental flaw with Gary Johnson is that other than Aleppo, nobody's ever heard of him, right? 70% of the people have never heard of Gary Johnson. They've never heard of the Libertarian Party. And so to punch through that, he's trying to use a social media campaign but that only goes so far. Aleppo may be the high point of his whole career as a presidential politician because it's the first time he actually got on the evening news.
Lynda, I want to ask you, though, both presidential debate, we know that the presidential debates, they've missed the cutoff for that. A lot of eyeballs, they could have had a chance to see them in action. What do you think? Do they really have a shot at this?
Look, I think it's really unlikely. I mean, you heard Doug talking a little bit about Ross Perot and some of the other independent candidates we've seen in the past. You know, while this has been an election cycle where it seems almost like anything can happen, at the end of the day, you still have to have something to vote for. And as Rick points out, the only thing people really know Gary Johnson for is the fact that he didn't know what Aleppo was. And that is not a good reason for people to recognize your name. You know, if he had had the ability to maybe make some, some energy and get some traction just a little bit earlier, maybe he could build some sort of an operation. But the thing that Bernie Sanders did in having 5.5 million individual contributions, you know, it was like he struck lightning. And I just think that's very, very unlikely for any candidate, much less for Gary Johnson, the way things are shaping up this cycle.
Well, Rick was talking about breaking through. There's the other thing, if you look historically at third-party candidates, they have either a strong regional base often, or they have a strong issue. You know, you played the tape of Ross Perot, and he was always talking about that deficit and that budget. You know, if you have a single issue, you can start with that constituency that cares about that issue as a base and grow out from there. If you have a single region of the country, as some third-party candidates have, you start with that as a base and grow out from there. So that's where you don't see a commonality here with a Gary Johnson, where, you know, a place to start in addition to the things that.
What's kind of interesting about that, too, is that if you look through history, the third parties keep changing, right? One of my favorite quotes about it, I think, is Richard Hofstadter said, third parties are like bees. They sting and then they die, right? It's the Reform Party, it's the Green Party, it's the Boo Moose Party that did really well. And that's part of Gary Johnson's problem. We're not used to having libertarians. There is no party base, there is no infrastructure. So until there's a third party that can have consistent success, it's going to be a lot harder.
Or they get incorporated, right? They get assumed by a larger party. Often their ideas and their voters and their things get sort of folded into the platforms of the major parties and carried along. So they do have an influence, but you just don't see it directly in terms of electing a person.
But this is part of the problem we've seen with the degradation of the major parties is they haven't done that, right? They've ignored these movements, especially at their own peril, whether it's things like gay marriage or whether it's climate or whether it's other issues related to the budget. You know, it's almost like the parties have just ignored those things. So what do we get? Two very unpopular candidates, you know, with parties that have gotten smaller, not bigger, over the last 10 years.
Do you think that Trump or Johnson's platform is closer to the old Republican Party of your time?
Well, it depends upon which platform.
Because it's almost like the Libertarians have swallowed the Republican
Johnson's platform are two different platforms. I mean, Johnson really doesn't adhere to the Libertarian platform. And so, but like closing down the Department of Education was a Ronald Reagan idea. It's in the Libertarian platform.
I want to get Doug Wead weigh in before we leave. Doug, we know that in 1992, George H.W. Bush blamed Ross Perot. In 2000, Al Gore also faced the similar situation. What do elections have to learn from third-party candidates?
Well, there you go. I mean, we're talking two different things here. We're talking about third parties, and I've made the point that establishing a third party is almost impossible under the current system. But third parties have enormous impact. And in Florida, you just raised the issue in 2000, George W. Bush won the state of Florida after all those hanging chads by 537 votes. And Ralph Nader, who only polled 1.6% of the votes of Florida, actually had 9,500 votes. It threw the election to George W. Bush. So third parties, hard to establish, but they can have an impact and can throw an election.
Well, that bee sting might not last a few minutes, but it certainly still hurts for some folks. My thanks to Doug Wead, Lynda Tran in Washington, Rick Davis, Nick Thompson, and Anthony Salvanto.